I never thought I'd be sitting in a leather chair that cost more than my first car, staring at a company logo with my last name on it. Life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them, and my grandfather's death was the biggest curveball of all. Where are you watching from today? Comment down below. My grandfather was my hero. He built Mercer Industries from nothing, literally started in his garage with a single machine and a dream. By the time I was born, it had grown into a manufacturing empire worth over $150 million. But to me, he was just Grandpa Jack, the man who taught me how to fish, who slipped me $20 bills when my parents weren't looking, and who always seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say. We had this tradition. Every other Sunday, he'd pick me up in his old Cadillac. He never gave up that car, even when he could afford a fleet of luxury vehicles. And we'd go for breakfast at this little diner on the edge of town. The waitresses knew him by name. He'd order the same thing every time: black coffee, scrambled eggs, and rye toast. Then he'd spend hours asking me questions about school, my friends, and what I thought about the world. I didn't realize it at the time, but those breakfasts were the foundation of who I am today. The call came on a Tuesday morning. I was in my senior year of college, cramming for finals and surviving on energy drinks and microwave ramen. My mom's voice was hollow when she told me. Grandpa Jack had suffered a massive stroke while working late at the office. By the time they found him, it was too late. The funeral was a blur of black suits and corporate faces I barely recognized. My mother stood stoically beside my stepfather James, accepting condolences like a politician at a fundraiser. I noticed how many of the company executives seemed to direct their sympathies toward James, as if he had somehow already inherited my grandfather's position. It struck me as odd, but grief has a way of clouding your judgment. 3 days after we buried my grandfather, we gathered in the conference room at Mercer Industries for the reading of the will. The company's longtime attorney, Mr. Winters, looked uncomfortable as he shuffled through his papers. My mother sat with perfect posture, her hand resting on James's arm. My Aunt Clara dabbed at her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. And me? I was just trying to hold it together, still processing the fact that I'd never get another Sunday breakfast with Grandpa Jack. "Before we begin," Mr. Winters said, clearing his throat, "Jack left specific instructions that this letter be read first." He pulled out an envelope, opened it carefully, and began to read. "To my family, if you are hearing this, then I've finally run out of time. I've lived a good life. Better than I deserved, probably. I built something I'm proud of, and now I need to ensure it continues in the right hands. I've watched all of you over the years. I've seen your strengths, your weaknesses, your true characters revealed in moments when you thought no one was looking. And I've made my decision accordingly. To my daughter Margaret, I leave my personal investments and properties, with the exception of the lake house, which goes to my sister Clara. To various charities and longtime employees, I've allocated specific bequests as detailed in the will. As for Mercer Industries, my life's work and legacy, I've thought long and hard about its future. This company isn't just about making money. It's about the hundreds of families who rely on it for their livelihoods, the community it supports, and the values it represents. With that in mind, I hereby leave controlling interest in Mercer Industries to my granddaughter." The room went silent. My mother's hand tightened on James's arm. Mr. Winters looked directly at me and continued reading. "I've watched you grow from a curious child into a thoughtful young woman. During our Sunday conversations, you've demonstrated an understanding of people and principles that can't be taught in any business school. You have your grandmother's compassion and, I'd like to think, a bit of my stubborn determination. You may not have years of business experience, but you have something more valuable: integrity and a fresh perspective. You'll face resistance. People will doubt you, underestimate you, try to control you. Stand firm, learn quickly, trust your instincts. I've arranged for a transition team of my most trusted advisors to guide you, but the decisions must be yours. This is your company now. My ears were ringing. I couldn't have heard correctly. My eyes darted around the room, taking in the shocked expressions. My mother's face had gone pale. "This can't be right," she said, her voice sharp. "There must be some mistake. She's barely out of college." Mr. Winters adjusted his glasses. "There's no mistake, Margaret. Your father was very clear about his wishes." James leaned forward, his expression carefully composed. Jack always had an unconventional approach to business, but surely he left provisions for experienced oversight. A company of this size requires seasoned leadership. "The will is quite specific," Mr. Winters replied, shuffling through more papers. "Full controlling interest passes directly to his granddaughter, effective immediately. There is a board of directors in place, of course, but as majority shareholder, the final authority rests with the designated heir." I felt like I was having an out-of-body experience. Just days ago, my biggest concern was passing my marketing final. Now I was supposedly in charge of a $150 million company with hundreds of employees? "I don't understand," I managed to say. "Why me? Mom has been working at the company for years. Or James. He has an MBA and business experience." My mother's laugh was brittle. "That's an excellent question. My father always did have a flair for the dramatic." Mr. Winters handed me another envelope. "He left this for you, for your eyes only." The letter inside was handwritten on my grandfather's personal stationery. If you're reading this, you're probably in shock. Maybe you're doubting yourself, wondering if I've made a terrible mistake. I haven't. I've watched Margaret and James circling the company like vultures for years, waiting for me to retire or die. They see Mercer Industries as nothing but a cash cow to fund their lifestyle. They don't care about the people or the principles it was built on. But you ask different questions. When I took you through the factory floor, you wanted to know the workers' names. When I explained our newest product line, you asked how it would help our customers, not just how much money it would make. You have the heart and mind this company needs. I'm not throwing you into the deep end without a life jacket. Richard Winters has instructions to introduce you to a team of advisors I trust implicitly. They'll teach you what you need to know. The rest, you'll learn by doing. That's how I built this place. One decision. One day at a time. I believe in you more than you believe in yourself right now. Make me proud." I folded the letter with trembling hands. The room felt too small, the air too thin. Everyone was staring at me, waiting for some kind of response. "I need some time," I said finally. "This is a lot to process." My mother stood abruptly. "This is absurd. Dad wasn't thinking clearly in his final months. We all saw it. His judgment was impaired." James placed a restraining hand on her arm. "Margaret, please. This is difficult for everyone." He turned to me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Your grandfather has placed an enormous burden on your shoulders. Perhaps we should discuss this as a family, privately." Mr. Winters closed his briefcase with a decisive click. The will is legally binding and quite thorough. Jack anticipated resistance. There are provisions in place to prevent any challenges. I suggest everyone take some time to absorb the news. My office will be in touch regarding next steps. As we left the conference room, I could feel my mother's eyes boring into my back. The weight of my grandfather's legacy pressed down on my shoulders like a physical burden. Could I really do this? Was I ready for this kind of responsibility? The elevator ride down to the lobby was excruciating. My mother stared straight ahead, her jaw clenched. James made small talk about the weather as if we hadn't just had our lives upended. When the doors opened, my mother finally turned to me. "We'll discuss this at home tonight. she said. It wasn't a request. I spent the afternoon walking aimlessly through the city, my grandfather's letter folded in my pocket. Every time I passed the reflection of a shop window, I expected to see a different person. Someone older, wiser, more capable of running a multi-million-dollar company. But it was just me, looking exactly as lost as I felt. By the time I returned to my mother's house that evening, I'd made exactly one decision. I would honor my grandfather's wishes, at least long enough to understand why he'd chosen me. I owed him that much. I had no idea that decision would change everything, or that the real battle for my grandfather's legacy was just beginning. The moment I walked into my mother's house that evening, I knew I was walking into an ambush. The living room was filled with familiar faces. My Aunt Clara, two of my mother's cousins who served on the board, and even my mother's best friend Diane, who had no connection to the company but always supported whatever my mother wanted. "There you are," my mother said, her voice artificially bright. "We've been waiting. James has ordered dinner." James rose from his armchair like a CEO at a board meeting. "Let's all sit down and have a calm, reasonable discussion about this situation." Situation. Like my inheritance was a problem to be solved rather than my grandfather's final wish. "I've had a long day," I said, still standing in the doorway. "I'm not really up for a family meeting right now." My mother's smile tightened. "This can't wait. We need to address this misunderstanding before things get out of hand." I reluctantly took a seat on the edge of the sofa, feeling like a defendant in a courtroom. James remained standing, pacing slowly in front of the fireplace. "First of all," he began, "I want to say that we all respect Jack's memory and his wishes. He built an incredible company." "But," my mother interjected, "my father wasn't thinking clearly toward the end. The doctors said the medication could affect his judgment." Aunt Clara shifted uncomfortably. "Maggie, Jack seemed perfectly lucid when I saw him 2 weeks before." "You saw him for an afternoon, Clara," my mother snapped. "I saw him every day. Trust me, he wasn't himself." James placed a calming hand on my mother's shoulder before turning back to me. "The point is, running Mercer Industries isn't like running a lemonade stand. It's a complex operation with hundreds of employees, international contracts, and millions in revenue. It requires experience, connections, and business acumen." "Experience that you don't have," my mother added bluntly. "You haven't even graduated yet." "Grandpa knew that," I said quietly. "He left provisions for advisors to help me learn." James smiled condescendingly. "Of course he did, and that's commendable. But there's a difference between learning and doing. The shareholders won't stand for a novice at the helm. Stock prices will plummet. Clients will get nervous." "Exactly," my mother said. "You'd be setting yourself up for failure. Is that what you want? To crash the company my father spent his life building?" The guilt trip was classic Mom. Subtle, but effective. I felt a familiar knot forming in my stomach. "I just don't understand why he didn't leave it to you," I said to my mother. "You've been working there for years." A flash of something, anger, resentment, crossed my mother's face before her expression smoothed back into concern. My father and I had different visions for the company's future, but that's beside the point now. James cleared his throat. "We've come up with a solution that honors Jack's wishes while protecting the company. I'll step in as interim CEO while you learn the business from the ground up. You'll retain ownership on paper, but I'll handle the day-to-day operations and major decisions." "Just until you're ready," my mother added quickly. "Think of James as a mentor. He has years of business experience. He ran his own company before we met." I knew about James's company. a tech startup that had collapsed spectacularly after burning through millions in investor capital. He rarely mentioned it. "What does Mr. Winters say about this arrangement?" I asked. A tense silence fell over the room. James and my mother exchanged glances. "Richard Winters has been your grandfather's attorney for 30 years, James said carefully. "He's set in his ways, sometimes too literal in his interpretation of legal documents." "He's old school," my mother added, "resistant to change. We don't need to involve him in family decisions." That told me everything I needed to know. Whatever they were proposing probably wouldn't hold up to legal scrutiny. "I need to think about it," I said. "What's there to think about?" my mother demanded. "We're offering you the perfect solution. You get to honor your grandfather's wishes without the stress and responsibility of actually running the company." Her words hung in the air, revealing more than she intended. This wasn't about protecting me or the company. This was about control. "I'll sleep on it," I insisted. James nodded reasonably. "Fair enough, but we should move quickly. The market hates uncertainty, and rumors are already circulating. I've taken the liberty of having our attorneys draft some paperwork. Just a temporary arrangement to stabilize things." Of course he had. "We could sign it tomorrow," my mother said, as if it were already decided. "Make the announcement by the end of the week." I stood up abruptly. I said I'll think about it. Good night. I barely slept that night. My grandfather's letter kept replaying in my mind. "You'll face resistance. People will doubt you, underestimate you, try to control you. Stand firm." Had he anticipated exactly this scenario? Was this the resistance he'd warned me about? By morning, I'd convinced myself that maybe James and my mother were right. Maybe this arrangement made sense, at least temporarily. I knew nothing about running a company. My business classes had taught me theory, not practice. And James did have experience, even if his own venture had failed. When I came downstairs, my mother had already set out coffee and pastries, as if we were having a casual breakfast rather than negotiating the future of a $150 million company. "I've been thinking," I began cautiously, "and maybe a transition period does make sense. But I want to be actively involved in all decisions. And I want it in writing that this is temporary, say 6 months, while I learn the ropes." The relief on my mother's face was palpable. "Of course, darling. That's exactly what we had in mind." James nodded approvingly. "Smart decision. I'll have the papers amended to include those provisions." The documents arrived that afternoon, not the few pages I'd expected, but a thick stack of legal jargon that made my head spin. James hovered as I flipped through them. "It's all standard," he assured me. "Just formalizing what we discussed." Something felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I hesitated, pen poised above the signature line. Maybe I should have Mr. Winters review these first. My mother's laugh was brittle. "Richard? He's bogged down with the estate. This is a simple interim management agreement, not a constitutional amendment. We need to file these today to make the announcement tomorrow," James added, glancing at his watch. "The board is waiting for confirmation." The pressure was subtle but unmistakable. Every instinct told me to slow down, to read the fine print, to seek independent advice. But the doubt they'd planted had taken root. What if I was being paranoid? What if I really was jeopardizing the company with my hesitation? I signed. James collected the papers with a satisfied smile. "You've made the right decision. I promise you won't regret it." As it turns out, those would be the most prophetic words he ever spoke to me, just not in the way he intended. It took exactly 3 weeks for me to realize I'd made a catastrophic mistake. The company announcement went out as planned. James was introduced as the new CEO, while I was vaguely described as joining the leadership team to carry on Jack Mercer's legacy. The press release included a quote I never gave about being grateful for James's experienced guidance during this transition period. On my first day at Mercer Industries, I discovered my office was not in the executive wing where my grandfather had worked, but tucked away on a lower floor next to HR. There was no nameplate on the door yet. The furniture was generic, nothing like my grandfather's handcrafted desk and leather chairs. Just temporary, James assured me when I mentioned it, until we sort out the permanent arrangements. My orientation consisted mainly of sifting through outdated market reports and sitting in on non-essential meetings where my presence seemed more like a courtesy than a necessity. Whenever I asked about financial statements or strategic decisions, I was politely told that James was handling those aspects for now. By the end of the first week, I'd barely seen any actual operations. When I asked to tour the production facilities, something my grandfather had done weekly, James suggested I wait until things settled down. Things were settling all right, just not in my favor. The changes started subtly. An accounting manager who'd been with the company for 20 years suddenly retired. 2 senior engineers resigned within days of each other. The head of product development was reassigned to an obscure research project. When I asked about these staffing changes, James brushed them off as normal turnover and strategic restructuring. Then came the new hires. First was Peter Dawson, James's former business partner from his failed startup, appointed as the new CFO. Next was Melissa Chen, a college friend of James who took over marketing despite having no manufacturing industry experience. 3 more executives from James's past appeared in key positions, all with inflated titles and salaries to match. I tried calling Mr. Winters to discuss what was happening, but his secretary informed me he was traveling indefinitely and unavailable. My emails went unanswered. By the 3rd week, I could no longer ignore the pattern. I stayed late one evening, using my grandfather's old security codes to access the financial system. What I found made my blood run cold. Large consulting fees were being paid to a company called Vertex Solutions, a shell corporation I later discovered was owned by Peter Dawson's wife. A substantial marketing budget had been allocated to rebrand the company, stripping away my grandfather's name from the logo. And most alarming of all, there were preliminary documents exploring the sale of our most profitable division to a holding company with a familiar address, the same building where James had once had his offices. I printed everything I could find and locked the documents in my car. As I was leaving, I nearly collided with Maria Vasquez, my grandfather's longtime executive assistant, who had been reassigned to facilities management after James brought in his own assistant. "I've been hoping to run into you alone," she said, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "There's something you need to see." She led me to a storage room filled with boxes of old files. "Your grandfather kept a separate record system for sensitive matters. James doesn't know about these." She pulled out a folder labeled Strategic Contingencies. Inside was a detailed dossier on James, compiled by a private investigator. It documented his business failures, lawsuits from former investors, and, most significantly, his attempts to pitch acquisition plans to my grandfather 3 years earlier, before he'd even met my mother. "Your grandfather rejected his proposals outright," Maria explained. "He said James was a corporate raider who disguised asset stripping as innovation. 6 months later, James was dating your mother." The implications were staggering. Had James targeted my mother as a way to get to Mercer Industries? Had their entire relationship been a calculated business move? "There's more," Maria said. "Mr. Winters has been trying to reach you. James had your calls redirected and your emails filtered. Mr. Winters left this for you." She handed me a sealed envelope. The letter inside was brief but explosive. "Your grandfather anticipated potential interference with his succession plan. There is a critical provision in the will that was not discussed at the reading: a 90-day probationary period before ownership is finalized. During this time, you must demonstrate active management of the company to secure your inheritance. If you fail to assert control within this window, alternative succession provisions will take effect. We are now halfway through this period. The documents you signed may not be legally binding, as they conflict with the terms of the will, but challenging them will require immediate action. Contact me urgently at this secure number. The room seemed to spin around me. Half the probation period was already gone. In just 6 weeks, I could lose everything my grandfather had entrusted to me. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I asked Maria. Her eyes filled with tears. "James threatened our jobs, our pensions. Most of us have families, mortgages. We were afraid. But watching what he's doing to your grandfather's company, I couldn't stay silent anymore. I spent that night in a hotel, afraid to go home, afraid my mother might sense something had changed. I called the number Mr. Winters had provided and left a message. Then I did something I'd been putting off. I visited my grandfather's lake house, the one place he'd kept separate from the family business. The house was exactly as he'd left it. Fishing gear still by the door, half-read book still on the side table. In his study, I found a worn leather journal in the desk drawer. The final entries were dated just weeks before his death. James came by the office again today with another proposal to modernize operations. Same wolf, different sheep's clothing. He wants to dismantle what I've built, sell off the profitable divisions, and squeeze everything else dry. Margaret is completely under his spell. She can't see what's happening, or doesn't want to. I've finalized the changes to my will. Richard thinks I'm being paranoid with all the safeguards, but I've seen too many family businesses destroyed from within. The 90-day clause is unusual but necessary. It will force a decision, a commitment. Either my granddaughter will fight for the company or she won't. Either way, I'll have my answer. I've left clues, breadcrumbs leading to the truth. If there's any of my spirit in her, she'll find them. She'll see James for what he is before it's too late. The final entry hit me like a physical blow. Margaret came by today. She knows about the will changes. She didn't take it well. Said I was betraying her, choosing an inexperienced girl over my own daughter. She doesn't understand, or refuses to see, that this isn't about experience. It's about integrity, about protecting what matters. James has been working on her for years, positioning himself. I see it clearly now, even if she doesn't. God help us all if I'm wrong about my granddaughter's character. My mother knew. She'd known all along what my grandfather intended. The shock at the will reading had been an act. The emotional manipulation, the family intervention, the rushed papers. It had all been calculated to undermine my grandfather's wishes. My phone rang, startling me in the quiet house. It was Mr. Winters. "We don't have much time," he said without preamble. "The 90-day clock is ticking. Are you ready to fight for your inheritance?" For the first time since my grandfather's death, I felt absolute clarity. "Yes," I said. "Tell me what I need to do." The next 2 weeks were a blur of legal meetings, sleepless nights, and secret preparations. Mr. Winters connected me with Patricia Holt, a corporate attorney who specialized in hostile takeovers and family business disputes. Her office became our war room. "The agreement you signed gives James significant operational control, but it can't override the terms of the will," Patricia explained during our first meeting. "However, challenging it directly would alert James that you're onto him. We need to move strategically." While Patricia built our legal case, I began reaching out to the executives and employees James had pushed out. My grandfather's longtime production manager, Derek Wilson, met me at a coffee shop miles from the company. "I wondered when you'd come looking for me," he said, his weathered face breaking into a sad smile. Your grandfather warned me this might happen. Said if James ever got his hands on the company, it would be stripped for parts within a year. I need your help, I told him. I need to understand exactly what he's doing and how to stop it. Derek introduced me to other former employees who had been pushed out or resigned in protest. Together, they gave me a crash course in the company's operations, finances, and the changes James was implementing. Each person held a piece of the puzzle. The procurement director knew about the inflated contracts with James's friends. The HR manager had documentation of questionable terminations. The R&D lead had copies of product plans James had shelved that could have been game changers. Meanwhile, Mr. Winters had been busy. I've spoken with several board members, he reported. Many of them have concerns about James's leadership, but were told you endorsed his decisions. When they learn the truth, I believe they'll support you, especially with the evidence we're gathering. Two key allies emerged from these quiet conversations. Elizabeth Chen, the company's longest-serving board member, and my grandfather's close friend, was furious when she learned how I'd been manipulated. And Thomas Mercer, my grandfather's cousin and a significant shareholder, offered his unwavering support. Jack and I didn't always see eye to eye, Thomas said when we met secretly at his home, but we agreed on what matters most: integrity and people. This company wasn't built by stripping assets and squeezing margins. It was built by investing in innovation and treating people right. With a core team assembled, we set our plan in motion. Patricia prepared the legal documents to invalidate the agreement I'd signed. Thomas and Elizabeth quietly rallied support among the board members and key shareholders. Derek and the former executives documented the operational damage James was causing. As our case strengthened, I realized there was one confrontation I couldn't avoid. I needed to face my mother. I chose neutral ground, a restaurant where we'd celebrated family occasions when I was growing up. She arrived precisely on time, immaculately dressed as always. "This is a pleasant surprise," she said, air-kissing my cheek. "You've been so busy lately. James says you've been missing meetings." "I know what's happening at the company, Mom," I said quietly after we ordered. "I know about the 90-day clause in the will. I know you were aware of Grandpa's intentions before he died." The color drained from her face, but she recovered quickly. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Please don't lie to me, not anymore." I placed my grandfather's journal on the table between us. "He wrote about your conversation. You knew he was leaving the company to me. You knew about the probationary period. You and James orchestrated this whole thing to circumvent his wishes." For a moment, I thought she might continue denying it. Instead, something hardened in her eyes. "You have no idea what you're talking about," she said coldly. "My father built that company with my help. I was there every step of the way while you were off at college enjoying yourself. It should have been mine. So why didn't he leave it to you?" She laughed bitterly. "Because your grandfather was a controlling old man who couldn't bear the thought of anyone changing his precious company. He knew I had vision, plans to modernize, to grow beyond his limited imagination. So he skipped over me and chose you, his malleable granddaughter who worshipped the ground he walked on." The cruelty of her words stung, but they also confirmed everything. "And James? Was he part of your vision?" Something flickered across her face, guilt, regret, but it was gone in an instant. "James understands business. He sees the potential your grandfather ignored. James is stripping the company for parts. He's funneling money to his friends, preparing to sell off the most valuable divisions. Is that the vision you had?" "You're exaggerating. James is making necessary changes to increase profitability." "Mom, I've seen the documents. I've talked to the people he's fired. This isn't about modernizing. It's about looting." She took a long sip of her water, her hand perfectly steady. What exactly do you want from me? I want you to stop this. Call off James before there's nothing left of Grandpa's legacy. Her laugh was hollow. Even if what you're saying is true, and I'm not saying it is, it's too late. The paperwork is signed. The changes are in motion. The board supports James. Not anymore, I said quietly. I've been building my case. I have the evidence, the legal standing, and the support. I'm taking back control of my company. Your company? Her voice rose sharply. You think you can run Mercer Industries? You don't have the experience or the backbone. Maybe not. But I have something Grandpa valued more: integrity. And I have the people who helped him build the company in the first place. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a hiss. If you do this, if you go against James and me publicly, you're choosing the company over your family. Is that what you want? To destroy what's left of our relationship? It was the ultimatum I'd been dreading, but somehow, hearing it out loud made it less frightening. You destroyed our relationship when you lied to me, manipulated me, and tried to steal my inheritance, I replied, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. Grandpa was right about you, and he was right about me. I won't let either of you down. I stood to leave, but she grabbed my wrist. Think carefully about what you're doing. James has friends, connections. This won't end well for you. I gently removed her hand. Goodbye, Mom. I'll see you at the board meeting. The emergency board meeting was called for the following Monday. The boardroom was tense as directors filed in, followed by James and my mother, both looking confident until they saw Mr. Winters and Patricia seated beside me. James recovered quickly. What's the meaning of this? I didn't authorize outside counsel at this meeting. You didn't call this meeting, James. I did, I said, standing at the head of the table where my grandfather used to sit, as the majority shareholder of Mercer Industries. For the next hour, we methodically presented our case: the invalid management agreement, the questionable financial transactions, the strategic decisions that benefited James's associates at the company's expense, the exodus of experienced employees, the documentation from my grandfather explicitly stating his concerns about James's intentions. As the evidence mounted, James's facade of confident control crumbled. He interrupted, objected, attempted to discredit witnesses, and finally resorted to outright threats. This is absurd, he sputtered when I finished. This inexperienced girl is trying to undermine the stability we've established. The company will collapse without proper leadership. Elizabeth Chen, who had sat silently throughout the presentation, finally spoke. I've heard enough. I move for an immediate vote to remove James Sullivan as CEO and reinstate the original succession plan as outlined in Jack Mercer's will. The vote wasn't even close. Only 2 board members, both friends James had recently appointed, opposed the motion. When the result was announced, my mother stormed out without a word. James lingered just long enough to deliver a final threat. You'll regret this. You're not equipped to handle what's coming. Maybe he was right. Maybe I wasn't ready for the challenges ahead. But as I looked around at the team that had come together to honor my grandfather's vision, experienced executives who believed in the company, board members who valued integrity over quick profits, employees who had worked alongside my grandfather for decades, I knew I wouldn't face those challenges alone. Rebuilding took time. Some damage couldn't be undone. But 6 months later, Mercer Industries was back on solid ground. We'd rehired many of the talented people who had left, recommitted to the innovation pipeline my grandfather had valued, and restored the company culture that had made us successful in the first place. I still have my grandfather's journal on my desk, a reminder of the legacy I'm protecting and the lessons he taught me. many of which I didn't realize I was learning during those Sunday breakfast conversations. Sometimes, when facing a difficult decision, I find myself thinking, what would Grandpa Jack do? I haven't spoken to my mother since the board meeting. I've heard she and James moved to Florida after their divorce. Sometimes I wonder if she ever truly understood what the company meant to my grandfather, that it was never just about profit margins and market share, but about creating something meaningful, something that made a positive difference in people's lives. As for me, I'm still learning every day. I make mistakes, ask questions, and rely heavily on the experienced team around me. But with each challenge we overcome, I become more confident that my grandfather made the right choice after all. His final gift wasn't just a company. It was the belief that I could rise to meet this moment. That with the right people beside me, and the right principles guiding me, I could carry his legacy forward and maybe, someday, build a legacy of my own.